Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Akers. Islamophobia, or a fear of Islam, has increased since 9/11. A 2010 Washington Post ABC News poll showed almost half of Americans held an unfavorable view of Islam. And a Gallup poll says 60% of Muslim Americans feel prejudice against them. The Center for American Progress says Islamophobia has a negative impact on the freedom of religion in the Constitution and fuels the assertion that the West is at war with Islam and Muslims. On Point's Ashley Goossen has more.
Thank you, Bo. I'd like to thank my guests for joining me today. Today we have Boris Ricks, Professor of Political Science at CSUN, Kassem Nabulsi, Political Science Professor here at CSUN, and Edina Lekovic, Director of Policy and Programming at the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Thank you all so much for being here today with me.
Thank you.
I would like to start this panel off with Professor Ricks. So, Islamophobia, the dislike of Islam or Muslims. It seems to be at its peak right now. Why do you think this might be?
Well, as you know, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel here. As far as Islamophobia, I think that it's important to note that, quote, fear, unquote, is a hell of a motivator. And the idea of fear in its social construction can move you one way or another. So fear can be utilized to inspire, fear can be utilized to motivate, fear can be utilized to influence people to do something that they would not normally do, influence behavior, and in this case, probably political behavior. So that being said, the tactic, it is a tactic, is used to achieve political ends or political outcomes. So
there is politics behind this, you think?
Absolutely.
Okay. Ms. Lekovic, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is about to release her new book. It's called Heretic. In it, she says Muslim extremists are killing people in the name of Islam. And in the past, she has said that Islam itself is the problem that should be eradicated. Would you consider this a blatant example of Islamophobia?
I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali is part of a group of people who have a hostility towards Islam and anything related to Muslims. She comes from her own background and her own narrative, and I take nothing away from her story. But for her to label Islam as a religion of over 1.5 billion people with one simple label, I think is really toxic and hurtful to creating any kind of understanding between people. And that's fundamentally what it's about. Islamophobia is a really hot term, but fundamentally it is about fear or about hate. Not all Islamophobia is the same, and Islamophobia can be like other phobias. It's an irrational phobia, right? People are afraid of spiders, they're afraid of small spaces. They know rationally that those things aren't going to kill them, but they're still afraid of them. The same is true for Muslims. You turn on the TV today, of course, the news that you're going to get about ISIS or about Iraq or about Afghanistan or about Boko Haram or you name it, all over the world there's these hotspots. And so if you don't know any Muslims personally, it's no wonder if you have fear, because when you turn on the TV, what you see are dangerous, scary images. But we also know that the single greatest predictor of whether somebody has a positive or negative perception of Islam and Muslims is whether they know a Muslim. So exposure goes a great way, and I think unfortunately Ms. Ali's rhetoric is really divisive and fear-mongering when we have an opportunity for people to actually learn and engage with each other. And that's really what we need more of, because treating Muslims like an other or you know, a population that needs to be isolated and their religion ended is not healthy. And if you replaced Muslim with any other label, you would realize how absurd and disgusting that approach really is.
And kind of to play off of what you were hinting at, stereotypes. So stereotypes can be obliterated by knowing someone, because then you obviously get to know them and you make your own opinion. So what is a stereotype What is the stereotype of a Muslim, would you say?
Well, first, Communications 101 is you don't repeat a stereotype. Instead of denying, it's like the old Richard Nixon thing. He went out of office saying, "I'm not a crook." What do you remember him for, right? And he was a crook, so just for the record. But Muslims get a bad rap and they're misrepresented. Let me tell you who Muslims are, and this is according to what the Pew Center on Religion found. They did a study in about 2007, 2008, and they found, after polling Muslims across the country, there's 4 to 6 million Muslims in the United States, that they are mostly middle class, mainstream, and moderate. They share the same values that other Americans do around healthcare and education and safety and, again, the same shared values. So that's who Muslims are. There are other negative ideas out there, and there are other forms of Islam that exist in the world. There's not one understanding of Islam in it. The American practice of Islam is as diverse as you have as Muslims around the world. But again, this is a community that's as integrated as any other community.
And Professor Nabulsi, thinking back to September 11, 2001, do you think that that day changed people's perceptions of Muslims as well as the entire Islamic religion?
Well, I was going to try to ask different questions, but let me answer first yours. We need to remember that terrorist attacks on the United States, on the Twin Towers, took place long before 2011. In 1993, when they have a van tried to blow up the Twin Towers and get it down, 6 people got killed, 100 and more get injured. And at the time, there was no question about the public attitude toward Muslims. Then in 1996, Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States in a video. And at that time, we didn't have the same discourse about the image of Muslims in the United States. And then there were the attacks in Tanzania and Kenya. We didn't have the discussion about the image of Muslims in the United States. And then came September 11, and according to the polls that I've seen, the surveys, actually immediately after the September 11, Americans of all stripes have sympathy to Muslims in the United States. This rise of some anti-Muslim attitude is increasing long after the September 11. So I personally would like to take it in a different direction, this conversation, because I teach politics. And there are the 2 questions in here that I'm interested in. First, on how do we strike a balance between civil liberties, individual freedoms, and freedom of speech, and between civil rights and the protection of groups and their image, and so on and so forth. And the second question that I'd like to ask, and I'm sure my colleagues here would be able to elaborate in much more than me probably, is we need to ask the question, what is the source of this negative image? Is it the media? Is it the actions of Muslims around the world? Is it the absence of Muslims leaders in the United States being on television over and over again, sending the message to shape their image rather than wait for it and be reactive in that sense? And the third question that I would like later on to discuss is who's responsible for this image? But also we need to distinguish between public attitude and public policy. We need to connect to see if the public attitude actually is motivating the public policy, or political leaders are using the platforms to persuade the public attitude in that. If we strike that balance, we ask these questions, we are much more able to answer them much easier. A final point before I move on to this. There are distinctions between Muslims and Arabs. Arabs are only minority within the Muslims around the world. There are probably 320 million Arabs, and there are 1.5 billion Muslims. They come from all different nationalities, ethnicities, and stripes in the world. And within the Arab community, which they pride themselves to be the founders of Islam and Muslims, there are also a minority among them that they are not Muslim at all. They are Christians, some of them are Druze. And we need not mix up the attitude toward Arabs versus the attitude toward Muslims, because the base for this attitude is different and the outcome is different.
Okay. And then, Edina, how do you think that media coverage influenced perceptions of Muslims after post 9/11?
I think it's huge. So I have a journalism background, and I also grew up a Muslim, but a cultural Muslim. So my family's from the former Yugoslavia, commonly known today as Bosnia. And for me, I felt invisible when I would turn on the television, because I never saw people like me until the war took place there, and then suddenly we were on broadcast news. I also realized that this was also the same case with Islam and with Arabs, right? That generally when you're talking about news coverage, the only time that you're going to see Muslims, Arabs, South Asians are in negative news situations, right? News generally covers things when they break, not when they're working, right? And so if you're covering conflict zones and where attention is going, certainly since 9/11, there's been an understandable amount of media coverage related to all the political things that are going on within our country as well as overseas. However, we, you posed the question around, which I hear a lot, which is why aren't Muslims on national airwaves more, speaking for themselves? I would flip the question and say, why aren't national networks seeking to actually include mainstream American Muslim voices on their airwaves? Someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who you mentioned, represents a fringe voice, and I take nothing away from her, and I have full respect for her point of view. She's entitled to it, but she is not a mainstream voice. She, the fringe voices, and those also fringe voices of violent extremists like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like Bin Laden. I used to tell people it's not a fair fight, because Bin Laden can videotape a message in any cave in any corner of the world, VHS, beta, antiquated technology, and drop it off at any media outlet, and it'll get played over and over again all over the world free of charge, right? We're doing the best recruiting possible for him. But if mainstream Muslims stand up and say, we're against violence, we're for justice, we're for mercy, we're for love, we're for equality, these are Quranic values, the cameras look elsewhere. And I have plenty of direct personal experience with regard to that. Now, it's very easy to say it's all the media's fault, but the truth is that we also need, we didn't have the infrastructure as a community to respond to the challenge that hit us after 9/11. And I was there, I was fresh out of college, and it was 2 years out of college, and when 9/11 happened, we were shell-shocked. There weren't the kind of, we didn't have a Dr. King, we didn't have even a Jesse Jackson, we didn't have a pivotal figure who could speak on behalf of the community. Instead, what we saw were the holes of our communities were really being shown, and the fact that we had to be constantly in this responsive mode, we didn't help ourselves, right? And there's also a very genuine feeling among Muslims that terrorism isn't my problem. Getting my kids to school on time is my problem, right? Like this is not something that hits home for me, so why do I constantly have to answer for it? So we're constantly pushing against these tensions and saying, sure, it may not be our problem, but it creates problems for us, just like it creates problems for everybody else. And keeping ourselves safe and others around us safe is a genuine priority. So this whole swirl of competing things is there, and I'm happy to say that today I think there are more Muslims speaking for themselves on blogs, on social media, even on mainstream national airwaves than ever before, but it's just simply, again, completely out of proportion with the onslaught of real and also imaginary negativity that's out there about us.
You know, there are 57 countries of Muslim majorities. Some of those countries are our best ally in the United States. They have all of the resources to project the true image of Islam if they want. I personally, as a Muslim, don't know what's the true image of Islam. We have so many strands, we have so many ideas, we have so many, everybody accuses everybody, you are not the true Muslim, I am the true Muslims. And terrorism for us in America as Muslims, it's our problem like every American. It's not an outside problem. If we care about our neighbors, if we care about our country, it is our problem. And we need to improve as much as possible our discourse by first and foremost confronting these issues without fear, by afraid to even remotely argue, wait a minute, We have our best ally, Saudi Arabia, with so much money. We have Kuwait, we have Qatar. And the images that we see on television are real images of Muslims. I'm not going to take their identity away. As much as they don't want them to take my identity away, to tell me I'm not the true Muslim, I'm not going to tell them they are not the true Muslims. They represent their version of Islam. But whatever they do, it's affecting my image as a Muslim. And I'm saying everyone is entitled to speak up their mind. In this country, for people like me, civil liberty is sacred. The freedom of speech is sacred. The political correctness has no place in a discourse for me. So what I say again is that we need to be much more vocal. If we didn't have the resources as a community within the United States, we have enough resources outside who have the same interest in providing better image of Islam as much as we are here as Americans. And we should call upon them to use their leverage in international relations, in regional relations, and for us in domestic politics to be able to speak our mind. With respect to Hirsi Ali, she was a Muslim. I don't know if she converted out of Islam. She was a Muslim. She had a horrible experience within her own religion. And she's speaking up about her experience, her mind. I'm not going to condone her, but I don't condemn her freedom of speech the same way I don't want to condemn anybody's freedom of speech on this platform.
And Professor Ricks, I'd like to ask you, do you think that the forming and actions of ISIS have only fanned the flames of Islamophobia? Do you think that it's just kind of made it even that much more?
Well, I think the coverage of news events that transpire both domestically and particularly abroad do have some sensationalization effect. However, there are some accuracies that can speak to, you know, ISIS as a threat. However, I would say that, you know, I am remotely concerned at the unverified connections that have been alleged by participants in the U.S. who appear to be contacting and or soliciting, you know, ISIS to join ISIS in these alleged attempts to denigrate or say something bad and or negative towards the United States. Basically disgruntled young people, the ages of 27 to 32. You know, that particular cohort that appears to be being covered now, that was, you know, spoken about the past couple of weekends on the news talk shows, is an interesting new element that's arising, and I'm not really sure that, you know, that is accurate. It would strike me as very, I would be surprised if that was accurate.
And Edina, do you think that, referencing Charlie Hebdo, do you think that that attack has, in a sense, pit the media against Islam and then vice versa?
Not at all. I think that the Charlie Hebdo attacks were horrific, and they were the latest round of an assault on free speech. And just like we saw with the, you know, when there was the original Danish cartoons of Prophet Muhammad, and there was, you know, the fierce backlash that took place around the world, these waves of violence, right? And the same horrific wave of violence that we saw with Charlie Hebdo, these attacks were horrific. Does that pit Islam, the media against Islam? No. In fact, I think that the coverage afterwards was looking at the reality of the free speech debate and looking at the reality of how both Muslims and the French society was responding as a result. I think that there was, you know, there was some limited coverage around the backlash that French Muslims also felt in the wake of the attacks, because I believe there were over 130 hate attacks against Muslims in France in all of 2014. But in the week or two just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, there were also that amount, another 130 hate crime type incidents that took place. So those things get some coverage. But I think that the questions that the media has to ask are questions that have to be asked. again, I think that Muslims themselves, mainstream Muslims, should be incorporated into those conversations, and that there should be open-ended questions asked rather than leading questions, or what I've typically felt when I get invited onto mainstream networks is there's the, you know, something awful just happened, a terrorist attack just happened. Explain it to us. Mm-hmm. Why would Muslims do this? And that presumption of guilt, or presumption that you would understand, you're Muslim, that person was Muslim, help us understand how this could happen. That is what's really insidious to me, and that's what's really, that's where I put the responsibility to media professionals to, again, ask open-ended questions. Don Lemon on CNN recently asked a Muslim guest, do you support ISIS? Like, that's the assumption, again, on CNN that's taking place. These are not, you know, Fox News is a whole other, you know, alligator. But for that to be happening on CNN is just atrocious. And so that's where I put the media responsibility. Keep asking the questions, but again, ask open-minded questions, not ones that answer themselves.
Mm-hmm. And then Professor Nabulsi, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was recently accused of using fear of Arab voters to influence the recent Israeli election, which he recently apologized for. Why, in your own opinion, essentially, would he do this?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu succeeded in this election, mm-hmm. not only because he attacked Arabs in this horrendous statement about that they are coming in droves. It was in the last few hours of it. He was, you have to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu's political party did not gain any member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, from outside the coalition of right-wing nationalist and religious coalition. He took few mandates from Bennett, which is the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish house. He took from Shas, ultra-Orthodox religious party. He took from Avigdor Lieberman, Israel Beitenu. He did not take from the center or center-left within these Israel. And he did it cleverly. Has nothing to do, in most cases, with this horrible statement. He did it because he already promised one political party the finance ministry, political party that they're going to be part of the government. But the larger problem for the Israeli Arabs is more than the attack by Benjamin Netanyahu, which reflects only political tactic mm-hmm. for the moment. Many people do not believe and trust the Prime Minister that he is have a true confession about being wrong about it. But we should see in action what the Israeli government, any Israeli government, how it deals with the Israeli Arab as citizen of the state itself. I just want to go back for one issue about fear, which I agree with all of this. The phobia. Americans are full of phobias. We have phobias of African American. Mm-hmm. Have one African American walk into a white neighborhood in the evening and have him have a hoodie on his head. We'll see what the result will be immediately. We have phobias of gays. The phobias is not specific to us Muslims, but the source of the phobia might be different. Mm-hmm. And with respect again to the media, we cannot demand from the media how to operate. This is a capitalist society. They are after rating. They are not anti-Muslims themselves, although some talk show are absolutely. But the general media, accusing the general media with a broad brush is the same way that they're doing to us as Muslims, painting us with a broad brush.
And actually, I'm happy that you brought that up, that phobia, because as a final question, I wanted to give this out to all of you guys for an answer. In the past, especially like during World War II, we saw anti-Semitism, fear of Jews, fear and hatred of Jews. Now it's Islamophobia. Do you see this phobia coming to an end anytime soon? And we can start with Professor Ricks.
Again, you know, the phobia, what I call the boogeyman thesis. The boogeyman thesis is not going anywhere. It's been a tactic that's been used by elements within society for various reasons, and it is a form of behavior modification. And if in fact you want to move society one way or another, you pose the element of fear, as my colleague just mentioned. As one who is a member of a community who is no stranger to stereotypes and fear-mongering, it certainly can produce the outcome that those who use it want to produce. So do I believe this tactic is going anywhere? No, it is not going anywhere. What we need to do is, as it's been mentioned by both my colleagues here, is we need to be continually vigilant, continually be able to speak truth to power to ensure that stereotypes and phobias are rejected and see them as what they are, social constructions. And you know, collaboration and participation can do that. So as we communicate amongst our groups, as we collaborate amongst our groups, as we participate in forums such as this to increase awareness and increase tolerance and decrease ignorance, we can be a formidable opposition to phobia.
And Professor Nabulsi, same question.
I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. I would look back and find whether this fear has been perpetrated by one group stereotyping another and was successful in doing so, and now we're trying to reverse the trend by creating a different platform for our conversation. So that's the reason I began by trying to strike a balance between civil rights, which our recognition as a group, and civil liberties, recognizing me as an individual first and foremost, before I'm a Muslim or an Arab or anything else. If we are able to bridge the gap between those two elements, rather than look at each other in terms of groups, no longer Professor Ricks and somebody else, but the individual himself, rather than the black and white, I think we will be able. This is a pluralistic society, and pluralism meant that each group will have the privilege for itself to exercise its culture, its religion, and without depriving its members of their individual dignity and freedom as a human being.
And then Ms. Lekovic.
I have to be hopeful. I have children, so I have to look at the future as a place that can be better than where it is today. And I think that to take a lesson from other communities, and most recently the gay community, the power of coming out is huge. That when you can change someone from thinking about gay people at large or Muslims at large, and instead to think about Robert or Chelsea or Fatima or Edina, right? That changes the dynamic and that individuals go through. And that's what we have to do is not just move minds, we need to move hearts. And that's not something that's going to happen from the top down, from the heads of all those Muslim countries. There's only what they need to do is different than what we need to do. And what we need to do is get out and know our neighbors and get more involved in society, because that's the wave that we're riding. Muslims are one of the most integrated communities in our country, and people just need to know us for who we are.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can follow us at CSUN On Point, listen on KCSN 88.5 at 5:30 Sunday mornings, or watch us on LA 36 at 11:30 Sunday mornings. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Bo Akers.